left off, I started talking about Islamic philosophy, and specifically medieval Islamic philosophy. Now, what I had said about Al-Kindi was that what made him so significant was that he was really one of the first Islamic philosophers. He's not the only one. I'm just kind of picking him up as like the, if you will, like the crest of the wave. There's a whole bunch of people underneath him, too, or others at the same time, but he's probably the one that I can point to and say he's one of the earliest in this post-Islamic expansion in a period of Islamic peace, going, hey, let's wrestle with these questions. And the thing that I want you to recognize is here's really part of the question. You've got Platonism and Neoplatonism. That's something that the Greeks had, that the Islamic world inherits. You've got Aristotelianism, which, for reasons that I don't want to get into too much, these are different, obviously, but in Islamic thought, you can't really separate one from the other, even though they're different. And then, as these are two separate trajectories. And then what else? We've also got Islam. And then, of course, we've got other traditions of both of philosophy and of Islam. And here's the problem. How do these traditions fit together? Do they mix up? Are they compatible with each other or not? Now, the reason why, remember, so what's basically the thread here? Well, things like the soul is eternal. Things like, well, how do we know that something is the forms? But here now, no, that's the mind of God. Okay, well, that's going to be a sync-up that happens with Islam. So things like the forms, like Platonism, but also there's a world soul, stuff that we saw specifically in Plotinus. That tradition, Aristotelianism, things like, if you want to know something, it's material, efficient, formal, final causes, all that, really that descriptive aspect of reality. Aristotelianism, also the way that the universe works with all those different spheres, that's in that thread. Things about that Aristotle says about the soul. But when this gets inherited from the Greeks, there was works by Plotinus that end up getting labeled as works by Aristotle, which is confusing. So people kind of think like this is one big package deal, and even if there's inconsistencies. But this stuff's great. How does this stuff fit in with this? And in varying degrees, you get people wrestling with how these things fit together. Oh, this thing Plato said here, he really could be talking about Allah. When he's talking about maybe the demiurgos creating the world. That could be Allah. That's really what he's describing. He's describing it wrongly, right, from a position of jahiliya, which is the Arabic word for ignorance. Like, he's doing the best he can. Okay, but he's not, Plato's no Muslim. But nevertheless, these ancient Greeks are coming up with great ideas that can fit into Islam. Because remember, everything's Islam. So, we got this trajectory, this trajectory, this trajectory. Again, the main thing that we really like is here. We've got Tohen, that notion of God. Here we've got Theos, that notion of God. And here we've got Allah, that notion of God. And it really is kind of like a blending of all three. That's what's going on in Islamic philosophy. And not just with the notion of God, but ideas of the soul. Like here we've got the Psyche, right? Plato's idea of a soul, Aristotle's idea of a soul, which is a little bit different. The Islamic conception of the soul, something breathed into you. You see that in Judaism and Christianity as well. Something that's breathed in, the living aspect. How does it work? And kind of a mixing of these ideas. Okay, how the universe works. So it's not just related to theology proper. Theology is just any God talk in general. Okay, if I'm talking about scriptures, it might be theology. When I use the phrase, and anyone else uses the phrase theology proper, that means specifically talking about the being and nature of God. What I'm saying here is this incorporation of Aristotelianism and Platonism is not merely about theology proper, but about all kinds of things. Plato said this stuff about how a city ought to be ruled. Now, we didn't talk about that in here, really. He writes a whole book called The Republic, which is about how we ought to organize society. Aristotle writes a book called Politics, about how we have to organize society. And Plato talks about the philosopher king. Aristotle talks about the best forms of government. And the Muslims will look at this and go, Muhammad, he's a philosopher king. He is exactly the kind of person that Plato was talking about. All right, so how do you come up with a good government? So all those ideas, Platonism and Aristotelianism coming together. Now we saw Al-Kindi And the early Islamic thinkers, and really actually the early Christian thinkers too, are going to lean heavily towards the Neoplatonism first. And Aristotle, yeah, he's neat. But then later, the Christians are early too, really heavily into Neoplatonism. And then there's a shift over time into Aristotelianism. Okay, really in all the traditions. Judaism is part of Islamic philosophy. Historically, I'll explain why that is. Because you're like, wait a minute, Islam is not Judaism. Yes, you're correct. But the early Jewish communities that developed philosophy are found in the Islamic world, what are called dhimmi. Okay, those are basically communities of non-Muslims inside the Islamic world. So we're going to see this shifting. We've already seen it in Al-Kindi. He was a bit of a Neoplatonist. So what we see in Abu Nasr Muhammad ibn Muhammad Farabi, okay, who would be Iranian today, okay, from Persia, is he is a strong Neoplatonist. So really, what he's trying to do is mix especially these two concepts, the concept of Allah and the concept of the One, Tohen. So stuff that he sees in like Plato's Timaeus, which is a book about the creation of the world, he really tries to say, hey, that's really describing what Allah did. It's doing it as like a fable, but it's describing what Allah did. And he also spends a lot of time trying to reconcile the discrepancies. What do I mean by discrepancies there? One of the problems when you do this is that sometimes the traditions, like, okay, oh, this is kind of talking about God, this is talking about God, this is talking about God. It's all the same. Sure, that sounds great. What do you do when seems like there's things that explicitly contradict each other? Al-Kindi was wrestling with this too, but Al-Farabi goes out of his way to spend a lot of time trying to make it fit. So stuff like the big one that comes up a lot when it comes to science or natural philosophy. What do we do when we're talking about creation? What do we do when we're talking about the immortality of the soul? Or immortality of the soul. Things like that. Well, what problems could be presented there? Now, I said this last time too. In the scientific conception, in Aristotle's view, the universe is eternal. It's always been there. It never started. There wasn't some point in the beginning and then it didn't happen. It's always been there. According to Al-Quran, what did Allah do? 6 days created the world. There's a similar scenario there in Christian and Jewish thought too. But God created. God was there, just, to conjugate my verbs carefully here, just being, and then God created. Even the word then there doesn't work because there's no time until creation exists. Well, okay, now we have a discrepancy. Has the universe always been here, or did it get started? What do we do with that? Well, that's kind of what Al-Farabi's project is. It's going, these things must be true, but that seems like a contradiction. So there must be ways in which one's true and ways in which the other's true. Maybe they're talking about it in different ways. I don't know exactly what those ways are, but maybe I need to figure that out. Also the notion of the immortality of the soul. How do we know that we live forever? Okay, because Plato says things about the soul. This is a prison house of the body. But Aristotle says things like, oh, the soul is just the thing that makes you living. Well, those don't seem like quite the exact same thing. So Al-Farabi spends really his career trying to come up with all these discrepancies, not only between Islam and Greek thought, but within Greek thought itself. Plato said this, Aristotle said this. Are they both right? Remember, that's kind of what Plato himself was doing with Heraclitus and Parmenides. Heraclitus said everything's changing, Parmenides says nothing changes, there's a way in which they're both right. That's what Al-Farabi attempts to do here as well. But then what he ends up concluding, for example, is in a Neoplatonic position. Really, there's a sense in which Plotinus was the most right. Remember, Plotinus says, really, the one is just shooting out all this being everywhere, and so we're all made out of the one. Well, really, we're distinct from Allah, but really, our own being comes out of Allah. There's a sense in which we're made out of Allah, according to Al-Farabi. Now, according to certain forms of Islamic orthodoxy, you don't want to say that. Wait, you're saying I'm the same stuff as Allah? No. Okay, no. So later that's going to be attracting me to a certain thinker, he's going to say absolutely is not true. And it's not to say that we are Allah. It's not saying that. But that we're kind of echoes of his being. Kind of like Plotinus said. So strongly Neoplatonic here. I think that's all I want to say about Al-Farabi at this point. Let's talk about Ibn Sina. The Latins call him Avicenna. Now, Ibn Sina is one of the first Islamic thinkers that's well known outside the Islamic world. Christian thinkers in the 12th century will talk about him all the time, including Thomas Aquinas, who undoubtedly is the greatest Christian thinker of the 13th century, at least. So Ibn Sina said this: he's a brilliant Aristotelian. So Ibn Sina starts I mentioned there's a kind of a Neoplatonic trajectory. Ibn Sina is really the one who has an Aristotelian turn. He gets interested in medicine, and medicines can kind of see, Ibn Sina is very important in Islamic medicine too. And keep in mind, medicine is considered like, it's almost like a little tiny universe inside the person. So there's a sense in which studying astronomy and medicine, you could do both those things because it makes sense. Big macrocosmos for the Greeks, big universe, microcosmos, tiny universe on the inside. But they're both aspects, the proper domains of science. And so he's very important in those disciplines as well, and some other things. In psychology, the study of the soul, very important there, talking about, he has these huge commentaries on Aristotle's On the Soul, sometimes called De Anima. We use the Latin title for Aristotle's works very often. It has these huge commentaries where Aristotle will say, he'll take like a paragraph of Aristotle and then write a whole treatise on it saying, okay, he said this little thing about the soul here, but here's the application for medicine. Here's what this means here, or psychology. Here's what this means in terms of behavior. Like giant treatises. The main thing that he wants to say as an Aristotelian is something I brought out when I was talking about Aristotle earlier. And this is kind of an Aristotelian catchphrase, is this. For created things, at least, essence precedes existence. Essence precedes existence. This makes him an essentialist. We could say that this is the definition of essentialism. And in order to understand what this means, you kind of need to go back to the stuff on Aristotle. Do you remember how Aristotle had those 10 different categories of being? Like there's what you are, and then there's the other 9 things that you kind of could be, but all those are like the one category of being, like what you are, the essence. That's the unchangeable thing. That's what you are. All the other things are like boxes you can tick off. They're options. What this means is, which comes first? It's kind of like a chicken and the egg question. Which comes first? What you are, or the various other options? And Ibn Sina's response to this is, your essence comes first. You are what you are, and then all the other features are optional and come later. So what does this mean? Like, you are a human. That comes before really you having the color hair that you have, or the gender that you are. You're human first. Now we could narrow this down too. We could make essence. We could then take like our gender as an essence. You are a man, therefore do this. You are a woman, therefore do this. Now I was saying that stuff about Aristotle already, but he's saying exactly that. You have a starting of what you are, and from there then you figure out what you do. Because essence means what you are, existence means what you do. So you start with what you are is the determining factor in what you do. And so what you do should be based upon what you are. Now I'm going to go ahead and preview it. I'm not going to talk about it now. But the inverse of this is what's called existentialism, which is the idea that existence precedes essence. He's not saying that. He's saying, frankly, the opposite. But I want to point out, what would that be? I don't start with some preconceived notion of what I am and then do stuff. I do what I do, and I make myself who I am. Who I am is a creation not of something that's been imposed on me, but of my choices. And that's called existentialism. It's a big deal in the 20th century. I make me. Sure, some things I didn't choose to be. I didn't choose to be born here. I didn't choose the body that I came into, or my gender, at least when I was born. But nevertheless, I find myself here, and I make choices that determine ultimately who I am. That's existentialism, which is a protest, really, of this view. Essentialism. You are what you are. You've been made that way. By Allah, in this case. Find out how you've been created, do that thing. There's various applications. Some of the applications are benign. If you're a king, then be a good king. Take care of your subjects. But then there are other ones that end up being more controversial where we go, I don't know about that. You're a woman. Bear children. Clean things. Okay, so it's goodness, I think, is contingent sometimes on our modern conceptions. That's at least the idea of essentialism is this. You are something. Now you act in a certain way as a result. However, it's interesting. This only works for created things because Allah here, remember, His essence is His existence. Okay, that is, He is what He does and He does what He is. God doesn't learn new things. God's not going to get a new hobby one day. He is what He does. That's not true for us. We are human beings, particular enfleshed instances. And then later we do things, after we're born. And it takes us a long time to even figure out how to do things. But Ibn Sina is also important in that he makes kind of a name for Aristotle within the Islamic world, much to the chagrin of this next figure. And really, I mention Ibn Sina in this way because of this one, Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazal, his anglicized name. If I hadn't mentioned it, the Arabic word for philosophy is falsafa. It sounds very similar to the English and the Greek, frankly. The Arabic word for cannot understand it, incomprehensible, is tahafut. Okay? So, Al-Ghazali writes a book called Tahafut al-Falsafa, which means the incoherence of philosophy. It doesn't make any sense, and it's stupid. Because here's the deal. You know Plato and Plotinus and Aristotle and all those Greeks? You know how Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina have said they're pretty smart? They're not. They're heathens. Kufr. Burning in hell. Because they're not Muslims. Why do we care at all about anything these infidels had to say? Why do we care? They're not Muslims. When they're talking about Tawhid or faith, they're not talking about Allah. They're talking about their idols. Why should we care? Philosophy leads to unbelief. Talking about science, asking questions, having these conversations. Especially for people who are weak-minded. Like people who, yeah, sure, philosophers can talk about these things and sound all smart amongst each other. That's great. Good for them. But when the common people hear about this kind of stuff, they start, wait a minute. You're telling me maybe Aristotle or Plato says that God didn't create the world? Well, now I have doubt. So did He create it or did He not? I don't know. Now I have doubt. Now I'm questioning my faith. Stop it. This is why philosophy needs to be cut out. Focus on, you want to be good Muslim thinkers? Focus on the Quran. Focus on Islam. Stop the philosophy stuff. It's a disruption. In fact, all this stuff about cause and effect, remember this whole material, efficient, this stuff. Formal, final, all that. Aristotle? That's Aristotle's concept of causation, right? Again, when we talk about cause and effect, we probably only mean efficient. But Al-Ghazali is what's called an occasionalist. What does it mean to be an occasionalist or occasionalism?
You pick what you like when it fits you.
That sounds like it makes sense. So here's what I think it could mean that in a colloquial sense. But here's the deal. Here's what it means, at least in the context of Al-Ghazali. There's those causes, right? Go back to the tree. What's the tree made out of? Wood. How'd it get there? Seeds. What's it look like? A tree. What's it for? Shade, or what have you. Pick something. Even in a modern sense, you could say it's for making oxygen. It's fine. What's it made out of? Stuff Allah made. How'd it get there? Allah put it there. What shape is it? Whatever shape Allah says it is. What's it for? The glory of Allah. What's occasionalism then? Allah is the ultimate causal agent, and more specifically, the occasionalism part is that He's the direct cause of every event. What made that sound when I dropped the marker? What pulled the marker down? Oh, gravity. Allah. What? Am I willing myself to walk across the room right now? I'm not doing it. What's doing it? So that's what occasionalism is. Allah is causing everything directly. Now, you'll see this with the Christians too. They'll talk about, well, is God the cause of everything? This is part of the free will, predetermined debate. Christians will go out of their way to say that, yes, God has willed everything, and Christians will say through secondary causes, meaning like things just kind of trickle down. Like God got things in motion, but things are kind of working out on their own accord. But God at least started it. This is not that. This is every single instance happens because Allah is willing it. Every individual thing. Every little tiny thing. When the wind blows and your hair moves, every single little hair. It's not just that Allah knows the way the wind's going to blow and the way every hair is going to go. He's making it happen. Everything. There's no like preset up. Yes.
But Allah is very aloof, and like it's not that He doesn't care about His people, but like He doesn't.
Yeah.
He wouldn't come talk to you because He's too dignified for that. So why would He be doing what?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And the answer to your question, and so what she's saying is this, I want to make sure it's clear. Remember I said this earlier when I was talking about like some of the, I don't know if I said that in here, but in talking about the transcendence of immanence of God in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Keep in mind, and those are all the three Abrahamic faiths, where God does a lot of talking, whether directly or indirectly. In Judaism and Christianity, God shows up. Okay, like Moses. I don't mean like He shows up necessarily in a human form, necessarily. Obviously, that's the whole theme of Christianity, right? So, but you could argue some theophanies in Judaism. But definitely, Moses, the bush is on fire, but it's also not on fire. Okay, because it's not being consumed. That's what the burning bush, but it's not being consumed. Like, it's not burning up. Right? Moses, do this. Go back, tell Pharaoh I said some things. Who? Do it. I am. Okay, all that. It's God talking directly to Moses. Jesus, obviously, I am. Okay? I am, and I'm thinking especially the Gospel of John there, where he's almost quoting that God talking to Moses. I am the way, the truth, and life. It's God incarnate. Or at least the second person of the Trinity incarnate. Okay? It's God talking. Allah doesn't do that. Remember? When Gabriel shows up to Muhammad in the cave. Okay? Gabriel speaks on his behalf. Angels speak on behalf of Allah. Allah doesn't come down and speak. So how is it then? That does not I understand your question. Doesn't it seem inconsistent if Allah doesn't come down and do all that little stuff? He doesn't talk because that's beneath Him. Why is He going out of His way to control everything? That seems inconsistent. I agree. Interestingly, Al-Kasali is part of a movement in Islam called Sufism, which is the mystical tradition in Islam, which emphasize, this is what mystical traditions do, they emphasize the immanence of Allah, or God, period. So like in Jewish mysticism is Kabbalah, there's various forms of Christian mysticism. But yeah, so the Sufism emphasizes the immanence of Allah. And here, it's not that He's coming down, all right, controlling little things, like coming down and doing it. It's that He's able to do this remotely, too. Up on high in the heavens, Allah is able to control everything. He still doesn't have to come down. But He's involved everywhere. So that's a theme in Sufism. Allah is involved in every little thing. And He's doing everything. And so when you ask the question especially, like, yeah, He made the material cause. Yeah, He came up with the idea for the shapes of the formal cause. Yeah, everything's for His glory. The thing that's most important for this view is that He's also the efficient cause of everything. It's not the water, it's not the soil, it's not the seed even. It's Allah. Period. Allah wins. That's all you need to know. But what about Allah? Okay, so this is kind of a reactionary. Ibn Rushd, who in his Latinized name, Averroes. Now those two dots over the E, that's not an umlaut like in German, so it's not it's not German. What that just means is that the O and E are two separate vowels. There's not a diphthong there. So it's not Averroes, it's Averroes in Latin. Again, I'm not quite sure how we go from there to there, but there we are. Now, let me give you some dates. 1226. And he is from Al-Andalus, in the city of Cordoba, which today is in Spain. So, like I mentioned here, we've got, Persian, Iraqi, another Persian. Here we've got, in this case, we would say, I guess you could say in modern terms, a Spaniard. Because remember, what today is Spain was under Islamic rule for hundreds and hundreds of years. It was under Islamic rule for more time than it has been since then. So, what's he about? And he's actually the one, if you go look at that School of Athens painting again, he's the one person wearing some headgear. Okay, so he's got like a wrap around his head. So he's got an outrageous mustache. Okay, in the depiction. So he's European, but we usually don't associate Islam with Europe, especially back then. Okay, but here he is. But he made it into that painting because he's considered so significant, really the only person you would kind of think of outside the European canon of philosophy. He made it into the painting. Well, first of all, he goes out of his way to tell us how much he does not like al-Ghazali. Remember, I told you the Islamic word for incoherence is tahafut. And so al-Ghazali had written this book, Tahafut al-Falsafa, The Incoherence of Philosophy. Ibn Rushd writes a book called Tahafut al-Tahafut, The Incoherence of the Incoherence. Okay, which is that's like the first troll title ever made. Like he's talking about how al-Ghazali's book itself doesn't make any sense. So how does it not make any sense? Well, and so really this becomes Ibn Rushd writes a book defending Aristotelianism against the assault of al-Ghazali. And he's like, look, yeah, some of our predecessors, Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, they got things wrong, sure. Sometimes they said things that were wholly out of accordance with Islam too. Sure, fine. Whatever. But your claims kind of don't make any sense for this reason. Let's start with this. Al-Ghazali, you said you don't want this getting out. You don't want people studying philosophy because it corrupts children's minds and that will lead people astray from Islam. Okay. Then why write a book about it? Because all the things that you're saying, you actually are giving it like a megaphone. You're exacerbating the problem by talking about it. Well, that wasn't very smart of you. So that's one issue. Two, you hate philosophy, but all your arguments where you're defending your Islamic orthodoxy, you're using philosophical argumentation to do it. Like the logic that you're using, you learned from Aristotle. Congratulations. You've talked about how philosophy is terrible by using philosophy. Well done. Well done. Amazing. So he says that's inconsistent. Then he spends a long time talking about this occasionalism stuff. No. There are secondary causes. And this goes back to what you were saying too, about, Allah really wouldn't that be too, isn't he too busy? Wouldn't he be, it's not like he can't do infinite things, sure. But isn't that kind of beneath him, what you're saying? That he's involved with, you don't want to do that, do you? Well, that's nonsense. But he also emphasizes this. And he says, this is the big problem. And he says, really? Al, you're right. Some of our predecessors got us into this mess too. Is that there is a distinction, or there should be a distinction, between these things. There's faith, really, and then there's reason. And they're completely different departments. Sometimes this will be put later as over here you've got philosophy and science. He's not using those words as such, but philosophy, science, but we could. And over here you've got religion. It doesn't mean one's better than the other. They're just completely different. They occupy completely separate domains. And they don't really overlap. They do to an uneducated mind, they do. They do overlap. But in reality they don't. They occupy entirely different domains. So, when you're looking at Aristotle, you're in reason mode. So things that he says about the universe even, yeah, they apply using reason. And when we're talking about things in a scientific way, we're doing things with a certain method too. Now, he's not talking about Baconian scientific method like that because that's not a thing yet. But he is kind of getting it. Like, it's anticipatory of that. But, like, we're doing things in a certain method. Okay, we're looking at the world. But, when we do things like when we read the truths of the Quran, that's doing something different. We're not trying to get exactly, like, the Quran is not telling us, giving us scientific data, okay, for us to extrapolate. It's giving us truths about the world, but not in a scientific way. And not even in a philosophical way. The Quran's not a philosophical text. Now, Ibn Sina would stress, but some of the things that Muhammad says in the various hadiths give us scientific truths. Ibn Rushd says, yeah, sometimes. That's a completely different thing. The truth that we get from religion is different from the truth that we get from philosophy. They're just different. And so stop trying to interchange between them. They're doing different things. Yeah, but what about when there's a contradiction? What about when there's conflict between the two? Hey, when there's conflict between the two, science is probably right. If they come to a head. So when it says stuff like, what about this? Aristotle said that the universe is eternal, it's always been here, but the Quran says it was created. What do we do? Ibn Rushd says, that would mean that the universe has always been here, it's eternal. But that contradicts the Quran. Well, the Quran's probably being metaphorical here. So when it says things like, Allah created the world in 6 days, what that means is that He's responsible for the world still. It doesn't make you an automatic heretic to say, yeah, we need to interpret this in a certain way. Keep in mind, this is not 19th century Christian liberalism. This is medieval Islamic philosophy. 800 years ago, someone's saying this. Schleiermacher, Ibn Rushd. Saying maybe you need to look at text differently. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean when you have those kind of conflicts that the religious text is incorrect. It's incorrect if you're looking at it in science mode. Look at it in a different modality. It doesn't mean they're contradictory. Those of you are Sam Harris. It doesn't mean that they're contradictory. They're just doing something different. It's like trying to understand a poem as a narrative, okay, or strictly, like confusing your genres. Okay, that's not what that's doing. Have you ever met someone that doesn't understand sarcasm? You're like, what? I'm thinking of, just as an aside. Remember, like in Guardians of the Galaxy, where Drax goes, like, nothing would go over my head. I would catch it. Like that kind of thing. Like, that's what Ibn Rushd is saying that we're doing when we mix up religion and philosophy. We're not understanding what's going on because we're in the wrong mode. So what he says is that we basically need to, when we're talking about stuff like theology, when we're talking about philosophy, we need to know our audience. Well, how do we do that? There are 3 different ways about talking about this stuff. The demonstrative, the dialectical, and the rhetorical. So in demonstrative mode, we're just doing theology. That's when we're just talking about the Quran as the Quran. If there is a conflict with science, it's not an actual contradiction. It might be an apparent contradiction. And we recognize that from the outset. Now this is now, I'm going to mention this when I get to the last one. This is a conversation that we have in-house. Who's doing the talking here? Theologians. The learned. The second mode is dialectical. This is philosophy. It's kind of like that Socrates talking to Euthyphro stuff. We'll get there. We'll figure it out together. We'll bounce back and forth. We'll have a conversation, and we'll get at truth through conversation. If there is a conflict, this is where we interpret the Quran allegorically. Obviously, science is right. We presume that from the outset. About matters of nature, not necessarily matters of God as God. If there's a conflict about something that's a scientific notion, go with what philosophy and science say. Okay, like, how long has the universe been here? Eternally, because that's what Aristotle said. Because we look at the world and figure that we don't want to get our scientific answers by looking at a religious text. That's just not what we do. We examine the world. That stays in-house amongst the philosophers. And then rhetorical. This is the common people. Now, Al-Ghazali kind of had a point, says Ibn Rushd. You don't just go talk about, you don't want to, people that are, it's not they're weak-minded that they're stupid, but they're just uneducated. Uneducated people, without the proper educational, we see this happen a lot, without the proper educational apparatus, if people come into contact with knowledge, with things that they don't have the equipment to deal with, bad things can happen. Okay? Now that's not me making an argument for censorship, necessarily. But some things, perhaps, says Ibn Rushd at least, not everybody should have access to everything. Maybe. Because what happens is this: people that don't have an education in theology, and people that don't have an education in philosophy, yeah, when they learn things like, oh, maybe the universe is a turtle, despite what the Quran says, yeah, that is going to shake up their faith. They don't need to hear that. It's not a conversation that needs to be had. So if you are the imam in your local little sunnah, don't go around saying, actually, if we look at science, some things that the Quran says, or if we can look at them in a different way, the average Muslim family doesn't need to hear this. Now, he's not saying it needs to be therefore restricted to a noble elite, but kind of. You don't need to go out of your way to have these conversations to the public. The public doesn't need to know this stuff, because they will question their faith, because they don't have the means to deal with it. Go for it.
So, say, if you're going to start to, they'll question their belief, which would be bad for them. What if they start attacking science? Is that a consequence that he cares about?
Well, that's exactly what happens. If you're around today, science doesn't always give us absolute answers. Okay, right? It doesn't. It helps us make generalized predictions. Okay, this is why people complain about things like, how do we know the planet's getting warmer if they don't know what the weather's going to be tomorrow? Because climate is not weather, you moron. But climate's like personality, weather's like mood. People have personalities, but their moods change. It's really that simple. No. Okay. And we also know that scientific models are meant to represent things to help us explain the world. They're not necessarily entirely true in themselves. Okay, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. We've been there. But even Rushd is kind of anticipating that too. Science is helpful. Okay, and it's right in some ways when we're doing that mode, but it's only helpful as it needs to be. It's still a tool for getting at truth. It's not some truth in some venerated sense itself. And neither is religion. Okay, truth, capital T. Okay, these are means of getting at truth in the world. But his main thing here that he wants to say is the rhetorical method. It's just know your audience. If you're talking to your average Muslim, you don't need to go out of your way to speak great religious mysteries to them. And I admire him. I talk about philosophy with my philosophy classes. I really don't try to bring it up at parties. Especially obtuse stuff. Well, did you know the etymology of this particular Greek? Shut up, Burris. No one wants to hear that right now. I know my place. Now, if someone asks me a question, sure. But you know that, I also, I've been grading your papers the last couple of days, right? When someone's talking, I don't interrupt them and be like, they're like, what are we supposed to take the exam with? You don't end a sentence with a preposition. There's a time and a place for that. Right? Same thing here. There's a time and a place for it. Don't just go out of your way to bring these things up and to mention it. Just when you're here, when you're around philosophers and theologians, sure. Common people don't bring this stuff up. They don't need to hear it, and you're probably doing them a disservice. Frankly, you're affecting the community that way. So Al-Ghazali had a point, but he went about it the wrong way by writing some inflammatory, incendiary things, complaining about, but then spreading the news of the things that he was, angry about, and then everybody knew about it. Don't do that. Just try not to bring it up really at all. Okay, with your average person. What Ibn Rushd does stress too is that really all of this though, whether you're doing the sciencey stuff, he does agree with this. Whether you're doing the sciencey stuff or you're doing the religious stuff or whatever mode you're using, really Islam is all about getting the truest knowledge of Allah. So for him, and remember in the Islamic mind, for Islam, this is not a split between Islam and non-Islam. All life is Islam. Okay? And this is why this is confusing sometimes to a Western Christian mind, because Christianity, there is this distinction. A hard distinction. There's religion stuff and then there's other stuff, and those two things never shall the two meet. Okay, at least for the last 400 years. But really, even when you're doing this stuff well, you're being a good Muslim because you're still getting at Allah's truth. Now, when you're in it, okay, you can't make definitive statements about Allah himself, but you're still figuring out about stuff about his world. And you know that from looking at both. Even though we're using a different methodology there. Go for it.
So, for this, when he's talking about the distinction between faith and reason,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's in modern terms it would be religion / philosophy. And
Yeah,
science.
yeah.
That's not. Is government included with religion, or is that just not even in question?
Well, see, so here we're talking about methodology. And so we're talking about government. We can still talk about the notion of political science. Sure, it's not science in the same way, but it means like knowledge. Like we can. So what we can do, like let's put it in a modern context, and thinking in a Averroist way. Allah said some things about the way that the world should be run, right? Muhammad said some things in the hadiths. There's principles in the Quran. We've deduced those in Sharia, right? So we have a tradition of things that we are definitely supposed to do. Okay, things that are halal, things that are haram. Cool. But also, we can learn things from things like psychology, maybe psychology, sociology, about things that might be more efficient ways of distributing resources and things like that. That's perfectly fine. We might want to even incorporate that into our governmental scheme.
So instead of government being something that you would decide on, you use both to
Yes.
Gotcha.
So the difference is, it's two methods, but they're both in-house. It's still in Islam. Nothing is divorced from Islam. And so when I say religious, I especially mean like the clerical aspects and looking at the texts. Whereas in like a European, American, Western sense, they're not under the same house. They're two different houses, right? And one gets mad when the other one starts saying, like, let's do stuff. They're two separate institutions entirely. That's just not the case in Islam. And that's part of the confusion. That's why we can talk about Islamic countries, but you can't really talk about Christian ones as such in the modern world. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to continue the legacy here. So one thing that happens that I really didn't mention, I'm going to go ahead and kill this though. Or I kind of mentioned this, is that talking about Judaism, if you took my comparative religion, this will be familiar to you. The Israelites go from having a kingdom to that being destroyed almost really twice. There's a period where the Israelites, who later become the Jews of sorts, they have their own kingdom. It's fairly synced up with what Israel is on a map today. It's actually larger. That splits into two. Rehoboam and Jehoboam, those kingdoms go just completely annihilated by Assyrians and Babylonians respectively. And then every time the Israelites start to kind of, or the Judeans as they end up being called, try to reconstitute their little, like, let's rebuild, let's make a new temple. Some other empire shows up and conquers them. Okay, Persians, Greeks, Romans. Then the Romans in 70 are just like, we're done. You're done. You don't live here anymore. There is no Judea. Get out. And so the Jews are expelled from their domain. And that's why Jews end up experiencing what's called the diaspora, where they get spread out everywhere. So some end up going to Europe. But a lot end up staying in what now ends up developing as the Islamic world. And they stick around in the Islamic world. Later, there's the various traditions that go to Europe. But what we're going to see is in the Islamic world, there's a Jewish tradition of philosophy. And it's distinctively Jewish, but it's interacting with stuff that I just mentioned, the Islamic community. Because in many ways, at least with their conceptions of God, Islam and Judaism have more things in common with this, at least. So, Allah and Hashem, and really that says this. That way. With Allah and Hashem, they share a lot of similar attributes that the Trinity does not. So there's more of an, I don't want to say there's an identity, but an affinity here. Like, Allah is Ahad, Al-Ahad. Hashem is Echad. It means it's like one. The Trinity is one, but it's also three persons as well, so that's a little bit different. These gods don't incarnate. They don't come down in a physical presence. And you could argue, wait, aren't there some instances where there's a physical presence? That's the angel of the Lord. It's something different. Okay? Remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get toasted? There's another guy in there. Not Hashem. Not God himself, but some other thing. Maybe it's Metatron or something. Hashem. So there's an affinity here. Some of their attributes, and these ones easily sync up with that Aristotelian notion of theos, too. And even the Tohen. That is the Neoplatonic notion of God and the Aristotelian notion of God. Like, these fit well. Christians have a harder time with this, according to Judaism and Islam, surely. We're going to see some Christian philosophy where they're going to be like, no, this fits just fine. First thing I want to talk about is Adi. Sadia ben Yosef Gaon. Or Sadia. So he's kind of like the Jewish Al-Kindi. So he's the first one to go, all right, we've got what the Greeks said, but we've got not only what the Muslims have said, we've got what our texts say. Remember, the Jewish texts are the Torah. There's other texts too. There's the Tanakh. But in Judaism, and this is post-first century Judaism, so often when Christians are thinking about Judaism, they're thinking about Judaism as it's described in the New Testament. But since the first century, what the Jews do, and makes Jewish religion distinct, because it's all in these diasporized communities, is it has this long commentary tradition where they've got like things that they said about the Torah, and the things that they say about the Torah, called generally the Talmud. For this class, I'll just say that. The Talmud is this textual tradition about what the Torah says, and engaging with it. So looking at the Torah, they've got that too. So here's things that the Torah says about God. Here's things that the Talmud says about God. He writes a book called the Book of Doctrines and Beliefs. And really, it's about two things. Part one is about creation. And part two is about law. Mitzvot. And here's what he says. Anybody talking about this whole creation debate, according to the texts, whether it be the Quran or the Torah, take Bereshit bara Elohim. All right, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Very cool. But then Aristotle says, Metaphysics, Book 12, that the universe is eternal. All right, we've been having this debate for a while. What do? The Muslims have some thoughts on it as well. And here's the deal. Were you there? Anybody? No? Then you can't know. So actually, he follows a kind of skeptical principle here. That notion of ataraxia, like we're not going to have an answer to the question because we can't go back in time. We weren't there. We're not going to time travel. Just chill about it. So stop bickering about it. It might be one, it might be the other. Maybe one day we'll have access to actually definitively find out, but don't count on it. You don't know. So chill. And really, that's what he says. So if you can't have access to all the information, stop deliberating about it. So you really should only speak on things which you have the expertise to speak on. So seek truth, but recognize your own limitedness in doing so. Okay? And then what he does in that second half of the book on law is he says, really, the law itself can be divided into two parts. The first table and the second table. And actually, this distinction has stuck. First table. So, and think about it this way. There's the halakha, which is most simply put in the 10 Commandments, right? 10 Commandments. You can split the 10 Commandments in two. Not just two tablets, but into two different kinds of, or types of law. The first table is for Jews only. So what are those? We'll look at, what are the first commandments? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. You shall have no gods before me. Stop making action figures out of gods. Me or anyone else. I mean, what's the first thing that the Israelites do? Yay, he brought us out of Egypt. Let's make a giant calf. The golden calf is supposed to be Hashem. No. Stop it. Don't make, I do not have, stop it. Stop making stuff to represent me or anything else. You can't get it right. You're not going to represent my divinity. Stop it. So don't do that. And also, like, my name, stop saying it. So they say Hashem, just the name. Okay, that's why even in English they do that. Like, Lord, all uppercase. It's this word in Hebrew. Lord. It doesn't say Lord there. It says this name. But the name of the Lord, that doesn't really make any sense in English, but there it is. Okay, don't even say it. Okay? Sabbath, Shabbat, keep it. Don't work on that day. Okay, those are things for Jews. First thing. We don't have to, listen, we don't have to, so think about it, they're in this community inside the Islamic world. Like, we don't have to make the Muslims do this. We don't have to make them keep this, or the Christians or whoever else. We don't need to go out of our way trying to convince people, you, don't make idols. You, honor the Sabbath. You, don't say the name. That's our business. However, the second table, that is everything else, that's for everybody. Try and disagree. Don't murder. Don't lie. Don't steal. Don't commit adultery. These are things that anybody would agree with, because they're true to reason. These are laws of revelation. You can only understand it if you're part of the community. These are laws of reason. Anybody with a brain can figure this out. You don't have to really even read the book of Exodus. You can just figure this out, and we know killing's wrong. That's why every society agrees on these things. They might disagree on different particulars. Find me a society that doesn't think murder is wrong, or adultery is wrong. And you might think, oh, well, not a notion that the family is important and people are supposed to stick together in some kind of way. That deception is wrong. Okay, that thievery in some way is wrong. Find me one. You can't, because they're notions of reason. There they are in the book. The notions of reason. All right, so that's it for today. We'll a little bit more about Jewish philosophy in the Middle Ages, and then we'll be moving on to Christian philosophy.